106-year history is steeped in our Jewish ethic for justice, not for our people, but for all people. Our history also provides us with the knowledge that extremism in any form is dangerous, not only for Jews, but for society as a whole. It is in this spirit that ORG has joined together with the Jewish Community Relations Bureau in Kansas City to seek justice for the plight of the farmers and combat anti-Semitism, thus helping to secure the pluralistic character of our democratic society. Combating anti-Semitism in any form has always been a major priority of our national organization. From the time we became aware of the crisis in our farm community, we have been seeking ways to inform our communities about this crisis. It is therefore especially meaningful for ORG in Kansas City to present this forum to you tonight, along with our co-sponsors, the Jewish Community Relations Bureau, the B'nai Yehuda Social Justice Committee, Kehillat Israel Synagogue, the American Jewish Committee, and Beth Shalom Synagogue. We are very happy that so many of you felt a concern and took action by attending tonight's program. We know this evening will be educational and thought-provoking. Now it gives me great pleasure to present to you Carol Smith, who is the Jewish Community Relations Bureau, Women's American Org Farm Crisis Extremist Project Worker. This is the first project of its kind in the United States utilizing a full-time worker. Carol's been instrumental in helping to develop this evening's program. Carol was born and raised in Kansas, where her father and brother were dairy farmers until foreclosure caused them to lose their family farm. She is also a professional musician and part of a feminist vocal group. Carol will begin tonight's program with a song which is a reflection of America.
Good evening. I would like to sing a song for you that I've been singing the last several years as I've sung for farmers groups throughout the Midwest. It's a song that Woody Guthrie wrote in the 1950s, and I've come to think of it as a song about stewardship and citizenship. Citizenship in that we all need to be concerned and care about the quality of life of our fellow citizens, and stewardship in that things like the air we breathe, the water we drink, the land that raises the food, are something that we all need to be aware of and concerned about. I know for my future, when I think about my grandchildren and who will care for the land that raises the food that they eat, I know that I want family farmers on that land that for whom it is a matter of legacy and heritage that land is cared for and passed on to future generations. This is a song, as I said, that I've sung for many farmers' audiences, and when I go back to a place that I've sung before, it's one of the first songs they ask me that I sing for them. And I know you know it, so I hope you'll sing with me too. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to New York Island, from the redwood forest to the ocean waters. This land was made for you and me. As I go walking that Crimson Highway, I saw a glory that in the skyway I saw it lovely, that golden cloudy.
Since 1972, David has served as executive director of the Kansas City Jewish Community Relations Bureau. He is author of articles appearing in the Shema, the Jewish Veteran, the Village Voice, Instructor Magazine, the Kansas City Star newspaper, and other periodicals. He has written extensively on Jewish community relations matters, as well as education and civil rights. He also is the father of 3 boys. A dynamic individual, David cares deeply and is truly committed to action on the farm crisis. He has been instrumental in bringing this situation to the attention of the Jewish people. He and Suzanne Parham, president of Federation, wrote a resolution giving credibility to the farm crisis and spearheading its passage in 2 national Jewish organizations, the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, the Council of Jewish Federations. He formulated the Farm Crisis Extremist Project, a project to help farmers in their struggle and to combat anti-Semitism. Women's American Org responded, providing a grant to bring this project to realization. Now, won't you join me in welcoming David Goldstein?
Thank you all very much. There's some people here whose presence I'd like to acknowledge. From New York City, we have Nathan Gould, who is the Executive Vice President, which is the real honcho, of Women's American Org. From Houston, Texas, Sarah Ann Cosberg, who is the President of District 9 of Women's American Org. Chicago, Illinois, we have Bea Forrest, chairperson of the National American Affairs Committee, Women's American Org. Now, we're also honored to have with us a number of members of the farming community in Missouri and Kansas. I'd like to introduce Ivan Wyatt, who is the Kansas State President of the Kansas Farmers Union. Where's Ivan? And from the Kansas Ecumenical Rural Issues Coalition and from the Kansas Interfaith Rural Life Committee, I'd like to introduce Jim Henry. Some trade union representatives and some elected officials or persons who are seeking to become elected officials to attend. I wonder, are there people here? I know there's some people here from those groups. Could you stand, all the people who are public officials and candidates to become public officials? There were 20, that's all we were going to do, but since there are just a few, we'll find out who they are. Garrett?
Gary Blumenthal, State Representative from Kansas.
John Montgomery, running for Lieutenant Governor of Kansas with Tom Docking for Governor.
Missouri, and now we're in Kansas. See what happens when we move to Kansas? Yeah, Harry.
Harry Wiggins, State Senator from Kansas.
Oh.
Carol Slater, running for the state legislature of Kansas in 22nd district. I'm Judy Rowell, a state representative from Topeka. I'm running for Secretary of State.
extremely crucial in dealing with issues related to the farm crisis, and I'm therefore very happy to have you here. Suggested, or rather sent invitations also to leaders of the black community. Are there people here from that community who would like to stand and okay. I'd like to thank, yes, ma'am. I'd like to thank Kathy Winter and the planning committee whose names are on your program, who worked very hard on this program and who just did a splendid job. I'd like to thank especially the representatives of Temple B'nai Yehuda Social Justice Committee, Miriam Edelman, Steve Cole, and Carla Bell, who helped us remember that while education is an important aspect of Judaism, it is through action that our Jewish faith is expressed. And therefore we have tonight the action projects that you will hear about later that you'll be able to become involved in. I'd like to thank also the Kehillat Israel Synagogue staff and the sponsoring organizations, including the American Jewish Committee, organization that has done a great deal in this area, that Shalom Congregation, Jewish Community Relations Bureau, Kehillat Israel Synagogue, Temple B'nai Yehuda Social Justice Committee for their concern and their commitment. I'd like to thank Boy Scout Troop 122 of Temple Beth El, and I'd like to thank my wonderful secretary, Angela Watson, without whom nothing would happen. Now, we're here tonight to discuss farm and rural anti-Semitism and the farm crisis. We would not be here without the work of Leonard Zeskin, who's a member of the panel, whose pioneering work and single-minded dedication in the face of great odds. The great odds were that he told us 4 years ago that there was anti-Semitism out there, and nobody believed him, including me, I'm afraid. Anyway, he brought this matter, along with Danny Levitas, who's another member of our panel, to the attention of the general and the Jewish community. And this issue this evening would not be discussed without the two of them, so I am enormously grateful to them. And now we know about the twin problems of extremism and the farm crisis, and the Jewish community has responded. The National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council has set up a national committee on farm and rural anti-Semitism and the farm crisis. 113 Jewish community organizations, or communities rather, 113 Jewish communities and 13 national Jewish organizations have adopted a policy calling attention to the economic and social problems affecting farmers, and have suggested involvement of Jewish organizations in coalitions, private funding, and provision of social services to alleviate the plight of farmers, their families, and to look at needed farm legislation. The policy calls for specific action to combat anti-Semitism, racism, and extremism as well. That was the first time this year, in February, when the Jewish organizations, the NJCRAC taking the lead at the national level, adopted a policy about these matters. And then the Council of Jewish Federations, the central national fundraising and social planning coordinating organization for Jews in the United States, adopted a policy based on NJCRAC's policies. And as a result of that, Jewish organizations throughout the Midwest, in Illinois, in Nebraska, in Iowa, Minnesota, have begun contributing to farm crisis hotlines or providing social workers to offer consultation. The American Jewish Committee has taken leadership in this area and will sponsor a national conference on farm problems in the fall involving Christian clergy and farm leaders. The St. Louis chapter of the American Jewish Committee this past month, in cooperation with Lieutenant Governor Harriet Woods, set up a legal hotline for farmers using American Jewish Committee volunteer attorneys. And the board of the Kansas City JCRB, along with Women's American Org, has funded the JCRB Org Farm Crisis Project. The project designed to work with farm leaders and Christian clergy persons and rural educators and elected public officials and the rural media. Now, I cannot say enough about the board of the Jewish Community Relations Bureau and Women's American Org and Nathan Gould, their national director, their national executive vice president, for their vision in supporting this project. And the projects that are initiated here will be used as a model for Women's American Org and Jewish involvement in all the other states of the Midwest. So the Jewish community has become involved in this issue, and the Jewish community is taking action on this issue. We are not merely educating, we are taking action. The Jewish community is standing up for its own security in regard to anti-Semitism and is working with others on that matter, and is committed to standing shoulder to shoulder with our rural brothers and sisters to help maintain family farms and the way of life these farms represent, and to alleviate suffering of farm and rural families. And we do so because of our right to guarantee our own existence, and because our religion requires us to help guarantee the existence of others. Now, to learn about these two issues of anti-Semitism and the farm crisis, our panel begins, well, it was supposed to begin with Roger Allison, but we made a change. So, our panel begins with Daniel S. Levitas, and I'm going to introduce him to you. I can find my stuff here. Daniel S. Levitas is the research director for Prairie Fire Rural Action Incorporated, a nonprofit rural advocacy and community service agency in Des Moines, Iowa. He has been actively engaged in rural community organizing efforts since 1981. His responsibilities now include coordination of training for farm counselors who staff the agency's Farm Survival Hotline, development of a referral network for farm families, and research regarding policies and practices of agricultural lenders. Along with the director of Prairie Fire, Mr. Levitas acted as technical consultant to the film Country. Mr. Levitas has been monitoring the activity of anti-Semitic groups organized in the rural Midwest for the past several years. He has been a consultant for the New York Times, the Des Moines Register, USA Today, and National Public Radio. And what it doesn't say, he is a brilliant, articulate, committed, hardworking person who cares very much about the cause of farmers and doing everything he can to be of help. Dan Levitas.
Thank you very much, David. And indeed, I would be remiss in my remarks if I were not to begin by once again acknowledging the Women's American Org, the JCRB here in Kansas City, and the several other Jewish agencies and organizations that have come forward to sponsor this program. You are to be commended for taking the time and initiative to tackle what is indeed a very complex and difficult problem. Complex and difficult at the outset and to the uninitiated, perhaps. And indeed also complex for many farmers who are struggling through the present conditions of crisis. But actually, for many of them, as it should be after some time for many of you, it should not be too difficult to determine upon which side you should rest. It should not be too difficult to determine, indeed, what some of the root causes of the crisis are, and most importantly, in what direction we need to be moving. Because the time, in fact, is at hand to make, for this country to make, some very specific and definitive decisions about not just food and agricultural policy, but about the well-being and welfare of hundreds and thousands of people, both the people who produce food in this nation and those who depend upon that food production system for their jobs and their welfare, and also for all of us who eat. I would like to simply focus my remarks on the broader perspective, how we got to where we are, what the nature of the farm crisis is in its economic and social and indeed political manifestations, and to try and provide you with something of a roadmap, with something of a guide to interpret both the remarks that will follow, a guide by which you can frame your questions, and a guide by which you can develop your own particular perspective and position on these issues. Not unlike the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem of the farm crisis is one that arises out of a set of chronic conditions. That is to say, this is nothing new for many, many farm and rural people throughout the United States and throughout the world. The cycle of displacement from the land, of disenfranchisement, of alienation, of human pain and suffering and despair as a result of being divorced from one's livelihood, a livelihood based from the land, should be nothing new to us as Jews, certainly, if we understand the biblical teachings and stories. And as I said, like anti-Semitism, which sometimes becomes acute from period to period, there is always a historical tendency that undergirds it. It is the same with the farm crisis. That is to say, for more than 100 years, since the establishment of the Homestead Act, in fact, in this country, farmers have been victims of a set of circumstances far beyond their control. And like many people who came to this country early and worked hard, they have overcome those conditions of adversity and hardship and antagonism with tremendous resiliency. But they have also had to count their losses. And in fact, I could count the losses here for you tonight, and I intend to do so in the few minutes I have remaining numerically in terms of dollars. But when we address the farm crisis, we must also recognize and respect that these losses are in deeply human terms. In deeply human terms. And historically, and I'm not even talking now about the present conditions of crisis, but historically, for example, from the establishment of the Homestead Act until the first depression, the other depression, as we now hear people in the countryside refer to it as, there were 5 major periods of panic and deflation, where farmers suffered not just from the weather, but from low prices, from high freight rates, from unfair trade practices, and in doing so, their ability to earn a living on the land was severely impaired. And in the 30s, following the Depression, we saw government intercede with a set of responsible and functional programs that for the first time in the history of this country provided stability for farmers and agricultural producers, economic stability that would guarantee them a fair income to recompense them for their labor and their investment. We saw a set of policies which guaranteed consumers also, for the first time in American history, a stable and adequate supply of quality food. And we saw government intercede in the market for the express purpose of establishing food security for the American people through the storage of surplus for hard and difficult times. And those programs worked successfully until in the 1950s and 1960s, a different ideological and political orientation took hold. And suffice it to say that the fruit that we are now harvesting today in 1986 in the countryside is the result, and it's a bitter fruit indeed, is the result of some very poor seeds being planted by government through the initiative of flawed policies. That is not to say that the government policy itself was flawed, that government intervention was flawed, but that the policy that they framed laid the groundwork for these current conditions. How do I elaborate on that? For example, in 1973, when Earl Butz, then the Secretary of Agriculture, enjoined farmers to plant fence row to fence row and told them the world would be their market, and encouraged expansion in the agricultural sector, no one was told and no one predicted, and no one, including the banks and lending institutions that loan money so easily for farmers to engage in that expansion, no one was told that in 1979 the Federal Reserve would institute tight money. And so the chronic conditions of despair, of alienation, of disenfranchisement, of unfair treatment, pure and simple, of farmers, and unfair treatment of millions of rural Americans, in the same way that unfair treatment has been perpetrated against many groups and classes of underprivileged people in our society, that it was against that backdrop of chronic conditions that the acute set of circumstances of the present farm crisis as we know it emerged. But you know, it's not really a farm crisis. It's not really even a rural crisis. It is, in fact, a crisis of national proportions. Let me outline to you very briefly what the experts say will happen to the economy of the United States if farmers like Roger Allison and others who are with us here tonight are faced with the prospect of low farm income and faulty policies in just the next 2 or 3 years ahead. These are the words of Wharton Econometrics and the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute from Iowa State University. By 1993, the federal debt will be $21.5 billion larger as a result only of the farm crisis, not other factors. By 1989, just 3 years from now, 275,000 jobs will be lost from the economy of the United States. And in constant dollars, gross national product will be reduced almost $50 billion by the year 1993. In fact, total farm debt today stands at $210 billion. And if we continue with this worst-case scenario, 2/3 of that debt will be unserviceable. $210 billion is greater than the combined foreign debt of Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. The United States has now become a debtor nation, and we are told that if our government continues to pursue their ideological commitment to free enterprise for the American farmer, which, as it's been said by others, it's more like everyone for himself, the elephant said as he danced among the chickens. If we continue to pursue, if our government continues to pursue those policies, this will be the result. And it will impact many people, rural as well as urban, farm as well as non-farm. The farm crisis is a very dynamic and complex phenomenon. You have the whole situation, as I alluded to, involving the human cost, the human pain, the suffering, the suicide, spouse abuse, alcoholism. In Iowa now, we have more than 2,000 farm families living on food stamps. 3 years ago, we didn't have more than a handful. We are conducting this forum tonight against the backdrop of tragedy, not so far from the state of Kansas here, of a 55-year-old woman who committed suicide because her family farm was to be taken from her after 76 years or so. by the federal government, by the Farmers Home Administration. You have the whole aspect of the legal and financial crisis, the tremendous debt borne by farmers, the actions taken, often punitive, often desperate, by lending institutions attempting to foreclose and recapture their investment as quickly as they can before equity deteriorates further. The fact that most farmers in rural areas today cannot obtain a lawyer who knows anything about agricultural law, and if they do, that farmer is not guaranteed that that attorney doesn't also do work for the local bank or local lending institution. In this area, you are brought forward to the complex questions of moratorium on foreclosures and the need for mandatory mediation and the need to allow people to stay on the land, indeed, even if they lose the farm, to keep them in the rural community. And then thirdly, the issue of public policy with regard to our food security in America. The direction of agricultural policy should be something that concerns all of us. And indeed, determining the future direction of food and agricultural policy in this nation and the survival of family farm agriculture is something in which we all can and must, and indeed I would venture to say are obligated to participate. The choice is really ours. And fourth and finally, beyond these rather hard and quantitative assessments, sometimes qualitative, we have a larger issue. It is my belief that the farm crisis should bring to the forefront some of the fundamental questions about the fabric of American democracy and what we as Jews and what we as American citizens wish to see in that agricultural policy and in the fabric of democracy. And that calls us to recognize and acknowledge the unique contributions that farm and rural life has made to America and the unique thread that that forms in the fabric of democracy. And it's my feeling also that it is insensitive, if not ignorant, for those in positions of power and authority who claim the mantle of expertise to themselves claim that, yes, that's all rather quite nice, but it's a little too nostalgic, thank you. That the family farm is a thing of the past, that this is all somehow the result of some accident of technological or economic inevitability. In fact, the farm crisis is a political problem engineered by human beings, and we as human beings are obligated to solve it. Thank you very much.
Speaker will be Roger Allison, who is a farmer from Armstrong, Missouri. Mr. Allison is part of a farming family. His father and brother are also farmers. He is a founding member of the North American Farm Alliance, which was formed in 1983 as a coalition of the United States and Canadian farm, labor, and social justice groups in over 20 states. He is currently executive director of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center in Columbia, Missouri. The center is supported by Farm Aid and the North American Farm Alliance and offers a hotline to all farm families and rural people needing assistance, information on legal rights, and the availability of social services. They also provide legal service and legal referral on matters and legislative information on matters relating to agriculture. Mr. Allison is a leading farm activist, and it's a great pleasure to have him here with us. Please welcome him.
After an introduction like that, I'm ready to sit down and let everybody else speak. But, you know, I think that there's a special thanks, you know, to go out to the Jewish Community Relations Bureau, ORT, for having this meeting this evening and to forward our work of understanding what the crisis is all about and how we can solve it. And so I really appreciate the opportunity that's been given me to speak this evening. I'd also like to thank David Goldstein for putting me on the program, and a special thanks to Carol Smith, who I've known for a number of years now, from her role of playing protest songs with farmers at the courthouse steps demonstrations and farm gate defense demonstrations that we've held all across the state of Missouri. So, Carol, thanks a lot, and I'm so happy that a farm crisis committee has been set up here to forward the understanding and the working together that it's going to take to solve the farm crisis. I would like to tell you just a little bit about Missouri, and the figures aren't very good. Missouri is one of the leading states as far as the number of farm foreclosures in this country. Missouri is the leading state as far as the number of inventory ground, inventory farms, 129,000 acres. That's farms that the Farmers Home Administration has taken away from family farmers. We lead the country in that, and the figure is increasing daily. We also lead the country in the number of farm bankruptcies. That's where farmers go into bankruptcy, reorganization if you're a business, bankruptcy if you're a farmer, to try and resist foreclosure and hold on to the family farm just a little bit longer. And so that does point out one thing, that farmers in Missouri are attempting to fight back. We also have the dubious honor of being number 3 in the country as far as the number of hunger counties. A study that was done by the Harvard Task Force of Physicians on hunger. And many of these counties are very close to Kansas City, not too far as a matter of fact. I'd like to relate just a little bit about how bad it is, other than that. In 1933, that was just about the depths of the Depression. Farmer sent his sheep to Sioux City to the commission company to sell. The commission company sold his sheep and wrote the farmer a letter back saying, "I'm sorry your sheep didn't bring enough money to cover the commission cost. Please send money." The farmer wrote a letter back and said, "I have no money, but I will send more sheep." Now, that was during the depths of the Depression in 33, when parity was 53%. And parity is what farmers in rural areas, that is the best yardstick that we have for measuring our purchasing power. Parity for the last 5 years has averaged just a little over 50%. And so the escalation of farm debt, farmers borrowing to keep on the farm, foreclosures, food lines, is all a part of this farmers not receiving adequate income for their commodities. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I always wonder how people get started in what they do. And certainly 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I wouldn't think, I had no idea I'd be doing what I'm doing right now. And that's standing up with family farmers. But in 1980, my father was foreclosed on by the Farmers Home Administration after he had built this great big hog complex that the Farmers Home Administration advised him to build. After he bought the 80 acres of ground across the road that the Farmers Home Administration said, "You've got to purchase this." And after he built a new house that the Farmers Home Administration said, "You've got to build this new house instead of remodeling your old house." And so with that escalating debt, in 1980, he couldn't make his payments. Well, we didn't know then that there was due process. But we started digging around and we found a little law called 7 U.S.C. 1981A. And that said that the Farmers Home Administration, before they can remove a farmer from his ground, has to accord him appeal processes. So we started through the appeal process. And it also said that if it's circumstances beyond a farmer's control, like in 1980 we had a drought and farmers have had adverse weather in Missouri for the last 4 or 5 years, that you could put off your interest and principal payment, and for 3 years. So the Farmers Home Administration didn't acknowledge that, and when my dad was at the doctor one day, my farm was next to my dad's farm, I heard the cows bawling, and the neighbor called up and said there's trucks picking up the machinery and picking up the cows. And so I called our attorney on the phone, and he said, well, stay away for a little bit and let me find out what's going on. They surely can't be doing this because you're in the appeal process. This was our federal government. So he calls back and he said, Roger, you better get over there and tell them that you don't want them to pick any more equipment up, because it turns out that if a farmer's gone and they come out and pick it up without any type of resistance, that's called a voluntary liquidation. And so I went over there. And of course, we know all the people in the area. And I knew the deputy sheriff that was there, and knew everybody else, basically. And when it came time for them, I said, well, you wait till my dad gets back, and then we talk about this. And my dad was going to bring an attorney along. But they didn't want to wait. And so I stood in the chute, and that's a chute is a loading chute that you run cattle up and hogs up to put them in the trucks. They had broken into this brand new building that had no disease in it, and truckers with disease-ridden boots were walking up and down the aisles with no regard whatsoever of sanitation purposes or the amount of money that they would get out of that livestock. They didn't care. And so when they got ready to move those hogs up that chute, I stood in the chute and I said, well, I'm not going to let you move anything else out of here. And at that time, the Farmers Home Administration supervisor told me that if I did anything to him or his assistant, that I would be doing it against the United States of America. And that really hit me kind of wrong. I had been in Vietnam. And that flashed across my mind. And I fought for my country and stood up. And because they're doing an illegal act, this guy's telling me that, he's going to have me arrested, which he did have me arrested. And so that sort of prompted my activism. What came out of that was eventually farmers across the United States, there was a restraining order against the Farmers Home Administration that stopped them from foreclosing on farmers until they gave them due process and 7 U.S.C. 1981A. And so my father went to federal court and also won on the way that the Farmers Home Administration had treated him, and it accelerated his expansion and the way that they tried to, foreclose. About 15 days after that, I received a letter from the Farmers Home Administration telling me to come in, and they wanted to review my books. And after that, they said, well, we're going to start liquidation process on you. Will you voluntarily liquidate? And so I did. And since that period of time, I've been fighting, and subsequently I won and stopped the foreclosure of my farm. But while I was in trial in the federal courtroom, in the back room, there were a bunch of farmers. I had never seen them before. And many of them had carpooled and put their resources together to get enough gas to get there. And the reason was because this law that I was fighting to save my own farm would also help them save their farm. And so they made a commitment to me, and I felt like, I just had that responsibility, to make the commitment to them and other family farmers, to be advised of their legal rights and to know how they could resist farm foreclosure. In 1983, through this whole process, in April of 1983, I helped form the North American Farm Alliance, a progressive group of different farm organizations across the country that are helping bring clarity and to the farm crisis, and much like tonight, and also to build communication links between different groups across the country to know what is happening legally and what is happening as far as putting a pressure on legislation that takes the change of crisis. In December of 1985, after a conversation with Farm Aid officials and an executive board meeting of the North American Farm Alliance, I formed the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. And the reason I formed it, and the bottom line for the center, was to help family farmers resist farm foreclosure. And you can't resist foreclosure if you don't have food to feed the family, if you don't have clothes to put on the kids' backs, if you don't have shoes to put on their feet, if you can't pay the electric bill in the middle of the winter time and the heating bill. And that's how bad the crisis is now. We received $20,000 from the National Council of Churches, and with that money, we have done 16 different food distributions across the state of Missouri. Maybe you've seen some of them on television, where farmers line up to get food. Not because it's free, but they line up because they're hungry and they have no money to purchase food. But along with that, we hook them up with the different services, like Danny said, food stamps. It's a necessary part of fighting back. Community action agencies that help them pay their utilities, different church groups that have food pantries and then set up support groups. And an important part of the Crisis Center is a hotline that we run, where we receive numerous calls from farmers that are on the verge of losing their farms and need legal counsel to help them out, to need farmers to talk to them, to let them know what their basic rights are and let them know that they have the support of people in the community and around them. This crisis, it's more than just an issue of economics. It's also an issue of social justice. Because you cannot eliminate family farmers without eliminating our rural communities. There was a study done in Nebraska where Nebraska, a state much like Missouri as far as farms are concerned, that by the year 1995, all towns under the population of 900 are basically going to be ghost towns. And the reason for it is because a family farmer has been eliminated. And our rural towns are our service centers. And when you talk about eliminating our rural towns and our rural communities, you're talking about our churches too. And you're talking about our schools. And you're talking about rural America. You're talking about losing it. And so we feel that we've got a case where family farmers need to have higher prices to repay their debts, that there needs to be an immediate moratorium on farm foreclosures to stop the process where farmers who weren't in bad shape 2 years ago and owed $800 an acre on their ground are being foreclosed on now because their ground's only worth $300 an acre. And they don't have enough assets to cover their debt. So the process has got to stop. Government planners and economists and farmers and farm leaders have got to sit down at the table together and present alternatives to foreclosure. And the paper that you've got in front of you that lists different suggestions is a program that we support, and is a program that we feel will help bring not only economic justice, but social justice to rural America and keep democracy thriving in our country the way that we know it. I'd like to close off by saying that we've got a table in the other room that has a number of books that show the things that we've done since we've been open. Food distribution, seed distribution, organizing farmers. And you probably have seen one of the things that the Missouri Road Crisis Center has helped coordinate. And that's where farmers in Chillicothe, Missouri have stood up against an abusive county supervisor, a federal employee, and said enough is enough, and they're not going to take it anymore. And there are some folks from Chillicothe here. I'd like for them to stand. Charlie Peniston is the leader of has done, has not only stood up themselves, but they've also gone on and asked for these very same things that are in front of you. Higher prices, emergency money for food and electricity, a restructuring of the debt, moratorium, emergency money to put our crops in and to feed our families. But they've also become a symbol for the farm movement across this country, where they've been there for 119 days now demanding justice. And so that is showing you the kind of stick-togetherness that's developing out in the rural areas. And, to form the coalition even more, to come into the urban areas and to tell our story and to draw the links together and demand justice together. And so I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that's been given me this evening to stand up and talk to you. Thank you.
Speaker, Leonard A. Zeskin. Mr. Zeskin is Research Director for the Center for Democratic Renewal, which is formerly the National Anti-Klan Network. He's responsible for monitoring activities of racist and anti-Semitic organizations and individuals across the United States. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the Jewish Community Relations Bureau and the chairperson of the JCRB Committee on Individual Liberty and Jewish Security. He's also a member of the American Jewish Committee National Task Force on Extremism and serves on the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council Committee on Farm and Rural Anti-Semitism. He's also a member of the Task Force on Social Justice of the New Jewish Agenda. And what his bio doesn't say is that Lenny is one of the most brilliant people that I know. He has extraordinary ability to conceptualize and to bring together the facts that he has. Besides that, he is one of my best friends. He's sweet. He's lovely. And he is the leading expert in the world on farm and rural anti-Semitism. Leonard Zeskin.
I told Roger that after David introduced Danny that if he gave me an introduction like that, I'd have to sit back down. He did it. I want to thank David. I think that the courage that David has had in the last year in bringing this issue before the institutional Jewish community has been very remarkable. It's not often that issues in the Midwest determine national Jewish policy, which is usually made in New York. And I think that the issues that have been brought up out of the Midwest and in Kansas City are setting the pace in a lot of ways for the national Jewish community. on those issues. I think that's very good. I also want to thank Danny and Roger, and I've been on a lot of speaking platforms with Danny and Roger before. In fact, we were on the platform together in Dallas, Texas, about 2 weeks ago at the Farm Aid training session where they trained about 200 rural crisis hotline people, and we spoke about these same issues that we're talking about tonight in the context of dealing with training people to handle farmers' financial, legal, emotional, and social problems. And they've been very helpful because while I may be the expert on anti-Semitism and racism, it's because of the cooperation, really, of the farmers' organizations themselves. And that's something very important to bring out because I'm going to talk about the scary stuff, the nasty stuff. That's usually my job. David usually brings me in tow to scare everybody. And that's usually my job in this. So before I scare you all about this situation, I want to say that the facts that I have been volunteered to me by the farmers themselves who are concerned about anti-Semitism and racism organizing in their midst because it's hurt them. And in fact, 2 years ago, Roger Allison who does a public radio show for farmers in the middle of the state, had a show specifically on Lyndon LaRouche and his organizing efforts among farmers, and had me on the phone doing a phone interview for 20 minutes so that I could help him warn farmers about Lyndon LaRouche, and that's 2 years ago. And I might remind everybody that Lyndon LaRouche didn't become a household word until this last fall, this last winter. But 2 years ago, Roger Allison was helping farmers understand that Lyndon LaRouche was something they wanted to stay away from. 2 years ago, Danny Levitas was helping me explain to farmers the danger Rick Elliott posed to farmers and his National Agricultural Press Association. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that the Jewish community has very good allies out there that want us to work with them. And we need to work with them. And I think that's very important to say. The Jewish community has been fairly good at understanding Nazis that wear white sheets and brown shirts. We've got those guys spotted. We know what they're about. We know that they don't like Jews. We know that they're committed to violence. We know that they're inimical to a democratic society. What we have not been as good at until the last year is understanding Nazis who say that they're not Nazis, who say that they're patriots. Nazis who dress their Nazism not up in the folds of Mein Kampf, but dress their Nazism up in the folds of the United States Constitution. Those are real Nazis nonetheless. They have a program of anti-Semitism. They have a program of racism. They have a program of a Christian country, Christian America. They have a program in which this is a white Christian republic. They believe that democracy is inimical to their way of thinking. And these are Nazis. But they don't wear white sheets and brown shirts, so we weren't as good at recognizing what they were doing. And that's very important to understand, that they were dressing this up in concern for family farmers. And how would they come into the countryside? How would they go into a town and organize? They would move into a town and organize by saying, we're here because we're concerned about you. These Nazis would move into town and say, what we want to do is we want to help get you loan money. So they ran phony loan schemes, okay? They said, we're going to help you with your legal problems. And they developed all sorts of occult legal theories about pro se law, common law liens, land patents, all sorts of screwy schemes that I don't have the time to explain to you. And they sold these to the farmers. It was easy to sell because in a rural community there's not a lot of lawyers around that were helping them out. And so somebody said, go into court yourself and here's the lawsuit and all you got to do is fill in the blanks. And you spend 2 years doing legal research, and by the end of the legal research, you've come to the conviction that not only is this legal theory right, but the Constitution is derived from the Anglo-Saxon Bible, and that the Jewish statutory system has to be opposed. The Jewish statutory laws have to be opposed because really this country is run by white Christian common law. And they say that the Jews run the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Federal Reserve Bank is responsible for your problems. And so they have a whole logical progression of ideas. And so what I'm talking about here is an organizing effort. I'm not talking about people coming in and screaming, "Kill the Jews." I'm talking about people who know how to bait a hook and pull in their fish. And they did that for a number of years completely unopposed. They came to farmers who were losing their place and said, "We care," and bring them dinner to the table and say, "We care about you. And by the way, have you seen this little pamphlet we have on the Trilateral Commission? Or have you seen this little tape we have on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion?" See? So they coupled their anti-Semitic organizing work with concern for these families, and nobody else was expressing concern for these families. And so they were the only ones there. And so they were able to gain followers, and they were able to do it for 5 years, essentially, completely unopposed. Almost completely unopposed. Like I said, people like Danny and Roger were out there. But in terms of the community as a whole, the newspapers, there was no problem. Right? So we're coming into this behind the 8 ball. All right? That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a whole level of desperation where we're 5 years behind the 8 ball. And we've got a lot of catching up to do. All right? In those 5 years, they were able to go from little organizing projects to developing an infrastructure, a movement infrastructure that had a number of organizations that learned how to collaborate with each other, develop a division of labor. You do this, I'll do that. Even develop some professional staff, develop the fundraising capabilities to have a full-time organizer. And we know what a full-time organizer means. A full-time organizer means that a lot of organizing gets done. And so they developed this political infrastructure over the last 5 years. And every year the situation got worse as far as this stuff is concerned. Now for the first time, now in 1983, let's go back a step. In 1983, the Posse Comitatus came to national attention when Gordon Call, who was a posse farmer from North Dakota, shot 2 federal marshals and went on the lam. Probably everybody's heard this story 10 dozen times. The important thing about that is, one, is that that's the first time that this posse movement had publicly engaged in acts of violence. And 2 is it made the words Posse Comitatus realizable. People saw that this was a problem, these groups called the Posse. So these groups called the Posse stopped calling themselves the Posse. Okay? Now they call themselves America First. Or they would call themselves the National Agricultural Press Association. Or they would call themselves the Iowa Society of Educated Citizens. Or the Missouri Citizens for Constitutional Government. So they're pretty innocuous sounding names. And so those groups were able to move in and organize on that basis. And then in 1984, one of the members of one of those groups got in a shootout in Nebraska with the SWAT team, and he was killed, and the level of violence escalated there. But still, there hadn't been an armed foreclosure, even an armed attempt to prevent a foreclosure. Through all of this, organization building and infrastructure building, they hadn't yet, en masse, took up guns. But it was bound to happen, and it did. It happened last November. It happened in Georgia, where the Posse Comitatus organized themselves to go down to Georgia and stand with a farmer with semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and pistols and prevent an armed foreclosure. And the sheriff wasn't able to come in and foreclose that day. Okay? Now that's not the scary part. The scary part is that the leader of that organizing effort in Georgia was able, 2 months later, to come into the upper Midwest and speak in 10 different cities and draw crowds up to 350 people and run around the Holiday Inn in camouflage outfits. You've seen them. People wear them on the street now. It's Rambo City in this country now. But wear this stuff in the Holiday Inn and talk about armed preventions of farm foreclosures, and people were eating it up. Now, people were eating it up not because farmers are evil people, but they were eating it up because they were expressing a level of desperation out there, needing something to do to prevent the loss of their farms. That's what was going on out there, and these people were speaking to it. Now, in this situation, I want to contrast it a little bit to give you a little fuller understanding of the problem. I am a national research director. A lot of people think Lenny, they think farm, but actually I spend very little of my time anymore dealing with farm anti-Semitism because I don't have the time, because the Aryan Nations is up in the Pacific Northwest this last weekend having a meeting. So I'm concerned about the Aryan Nations in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm concerned about the guys that's making the videotapes down in Los Angeles that say that the Holocaust didn't happen, and that and organizing his white Aryan resistance in the Southern California area. And I'm busy watching that. And I'm busy watching the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia leaflet school buses with black kids and white kids in them together, who were getting along fine until the Klan came and handed out their leaflets, and after that, the white kids started beating up on the black kids in the bus. Okay? So I'm concerned about all those situations. And I'm also concerned about the state of North Carolina. Because North Carolina, as bad as we've got it here, I have to say that the level of racist violence in the state of North Carolina is the worst in the country. There's a racist violent incident in the state of North Carolina between every 3 and 5 days. Once every 3 to 5 days. That's a significant problem in North Carolina. But in none of those situations, do we have regular, ordinary people who are good, upstanding members of their community being pulled into this stuff by their own financial and emotional desperation. In none of those situations have the anti-Semitic organizations been able to recruit members of the community who under normal circumstances would be pillars of their community. That's the distinct character of the situation in the Midwest. It requires a distinct set of solutions. It does. Law enforcement is important. Law enforcement is very important in North Carolina. In North Carolina, having a private army is a misdemeanor. So law enforcement needs to be beefed up a little bit in North Carolina. But law enforcement is not the primary problem in Missouri and Kansas and Iowa. Education is important. But education is not the primary answer in these states. The primary answer is in finding a solution to the difficulties in these communities. Because that will get to the root cause of what turns ordinary folks into potential Nazis. And I think it's the vision of the people that are up here this evening, and I hope your vision, which will make it possible for us to develop a program to attack this difficulty. And that's what we're all about. And so, even though it's biblical, and even though we have a commitment to social justice, and I certainly do personally, and even though I believe that the rural communities contribute something to the fabric of American life that is necessary, and I think it would be sort of like saying, well, we don't really need them, and sort of like some people who say, well, we don't really need the Jews in the American community either. You know, there's stuff like that on both sides. So I'm really committed to them being there because it's necessary and good for our country. But it's also important that we be involved because this is an issue that involves Jewish survival as a people. And that's a bottom line issue for all of us. And I think that should compel all of us into some sort of activity. I understand there's a variety of activities that you're being suggested to do. And there's tables out there with literature and t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. And those are first steps that I think everybody here this evening can make and help bring this problem to a close. Because I think we're in the beginning. When I look back to 4 years ago, I was very cynical about finding a solution to this. But I think now we're in the beginning process of being able to battle these Nazis for the hearts and minds. And we can do that. And I think we can be very successful at it if we give it a good shot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Dorothy Barry, who has been the executive coordinator of the Consultation of Cooperating Churches in Kansas, which is really the Kansas Council of Churches, since February 1977. She has a BA from the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, and has done graduate work at Teachers College, Columbia University, and the New School for Social Research in New York City. She is affiliated with the United Church of Christ, has served as president of the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the United Church of Christ, and is a member of the board of directors for the Kansas Church Women United. And what her biography does not say, as I worked with her on the Interfaith Rural Life Committee, is that she is a warm, committed, concerned person who is extraordinarily competent and cares very much about this issue as well as all the issues in which she is involved. And that she has accomplished a great deal in a field where sexism is the rule and has achieved a great deal. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce my friend Dorothy Barry to you.
I've been teasing David that if he memorizes the name of our organization, he'd be eligible to serve on the board of directors. And he gave it away tonight by saying it really is the old Kansas Council of Churches. The religious community has come to this crisis both early and late. Late because, at least in the state of Kansas, we've only been organized for about a year. Early, however, because the more I go back and look at some of the papers, look at some of the speeches, look at some of the minutes, the more I realize that there were voices out there alerting us to what was coming down the pike, and we were not alert to listen. Our black brothers and sisters in the black churches very early were telling us that black farmers were going out. And if we had had the sense to realize we not only would have sat there with compassion for them, but would have realized that they were the forerunners of what was going to happen to all of us. In the state of Kansas, one of the early voices is here with us tonight. Jim Henry was one of the first to get the attention of his denomination in saying that the church needed to do more than just issue statements and talk about this crisis. Jim was wise enough to realize that one of the things that happens in a rural community when this kind of crisis hits is the tendency of everyone to sit and point fingers at everybody else. If it just wasn't for him or her, I wouldn't be in this difficulty. And that what really needed to happen was that all of the people in a community needed to be brought together, to be helped to see that we're all caught together in a situation larger than us. And that the real question is, how are we going to stand by each other? And how are we going to really protect ourselves to see to it that the community does not go out of existence? A little over a year ago, I issued an invitation through the bishop of the United Methodist Church in Kansas to all of the leadership of all of the branches of the religious community, including the Jewish community. asked them to come together, that it was time we really took a serious look at this crisis and what the religious community was going to do about it. And we were really startled at the response to that meeting, because almost all segments of the religious community were present. And out of that meeting came a statement, a pastoral letter, that expressed in clear terms the concern of the religious leadership of Kansas for what was happening, and a determination to begin to rally the resources of the church to do something about that crisis. One of the things they called for was the formation of an interfaith committee that would begin to look at the whole question of rural life in the state of Kansas. Each religious body went back and determined who would serve from their ranks on that committee. When the committee came together for its first meeting, one of the first tasks it had was to organize itself and to begin to determine how do we begin to address this. And they decided that there were three basic things that they needed to do. They needed to attack the whole question of education. People like yourselves in urban areas who did not understand, and even people in the rural areas who did not understand what was happening to their neighbors. That we needed, through the resources of the church, to do our best to help get an accurate story out as to why we were in the situation we were in. The second thing that they decided was very necessary was that means needed to be found to stand by the families that were caught in this rural crisis. And the third thing was to begin to deal with the legislative changes that were necessary to get us out of it. In terms of the first, the whole question of education, we've done basically two things. And keep in mind, we've only been in existence now about 9 months. One of the first things we did was to bring together the religious leadership from all of those communities, recognizing that the pastors and the rabbis and communities throughout the state were really in a key position to know what was happening in each of those communities and to be of assistance in doing some organizing to address it. But we found, of course, that even those members of the religious leadership needed some education as to how we got into this. And so a number of seminars have been held. Last fall, we ran on the same day meetings in 6 different cities out across the state, bringing together the leadership, and some 600 pastors and rabbis attended those meetings, where they were educated, given a good course in economics as to what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 decades. We were greatly indebted to Cornelia Flora of the Kansas State University, who came and really explained the economics, how all the rules have changed on those farmers. One of the pastors came up to me later and said, when it comes to economics, my eyes glaze over. But she made it so clear, I think I really understand. And that was our clue. We asked her if she would be willing to put that lecture on videotape. And she has done that. We've made copies of that videotape, and they are now going out. There's about 6 of them from our office alone. Jim Henry has some. We put them in the United Methodist Library. The Central Kansas Library System has them. They're going out into communities where small groups of 15, 20, 25 people are gathering together of an evening to view that tape and talk about it. On the second issue of standing by and supporting the families that are caught in the crisis, like Roger Allison, we too received a surprise letter from the National Council of Churches indicating that thanks to the efforts of Willie Nelson, they were enclosing a check. All told, now there's been a number of those letters, some $45,000 has come into Kansas through Willie Nelson. And I want to bear testimony for that man tonight, because he has not done one thing to further his career through all that. That money came with a simple request. Please get it out as quickly as you can to families that need it. No rules, no regulations, no qualifications, no big forms, no rules and regulations of how to account for that money. Simply trusting neighbor. He had it. He knew we would be able to find the way to get it out.
What we did was once again utilize the religious leadership throughout Kansas, recognizing that in each of those communities, there were religious leaders who knew and understood what was happening right there in their town. And we said to them, would you be willing to search out the families that need the help and alert us to it so that we can get the money out to them? We said, you don't need to identify them. Farmers are going through enough. They don't need to go through having their name bandied around and kept in files and offices. If you'll vouch for the fact that you know a family in the community that needs that help, we'll write the check and get it to you within 48 hours. And in most cases, we've been able to keep to that promise. I wish you could read those letters. If you think Roger Allison's story was an individual story and an aberration, let me assure you his name is Legion. There are families all through these states, and each letter, I've gotten to the point now where you almost have to be hardened to read those letters, and I think they can't get worse than what I read last week. But they can. And they do. One of the first things that go when money gets tight is medical insurance. And when you've got worries on your mind, you know how that escalates the possibility of accidents working on a farm. It's known as one of the most stressful and accident-prone industries to begin with. And you put that kind of stress on the people working on the farm, and the accident rate begins to shoot up. So we knew that there were going to be need for funds both for food, for utilities, and also for medical care. So far, thanks to Willie Nelson and what he managed to stimulate the other parts of the religious community to do, because they began to look at each other and say, if he can generate money, we can too. And so an additional $15,000 has come to us from the religious community saying, add that to the funds you've gotten from Willie. So all told, in Kansas, there's been some $60,000 thanks to Willie's efforts. And we've been able to help so far a little over 450 families. Now, when I say help, that's obviously emergency help. In fact, the checks are small enough for a farmer that may owe $200,000 or $300,000. At first, I was almost nervous about sending that money out. But it has come as a powerful symbol that there are people who know and care what's happening. And I think that's one of the strongest messages that we have sent back to Willie Nelson. That not only have you helped materially, but you've sent a ray of hope into a number of farm families that would not have been there. One of the things that concerned the committee as it began to organize and begin to delve more deeply into this crisis, the kind of things that Lenny was just sharing with you, and we're deeply indebted to him for the research that he's done. Lenny, I'm glad you have not copyrighted your materials because my copy machine has gone at tremendous pace. We have copied that and sent it out to the leadership of every one of the denominational groups in Kansas. And they, in turn, have copied that copy. I may have to get new copies. It's fading. But rest assured that material is being studied in the denominational groups out across Kansas. The United Church of Christ just recently, on a nationwide basis, held a meeting right here in Kansas City, bringing people from across the country. Lenny and Danny were both at that meeting. I unfortunately was not able to be there. But their commitment is that they are going to rally their leadership to begin to do something about that back in their communities back home. And at least in Kansas, I've encouraged the leaders who were present from that church to help me do that on an ecumenical basis so that the leadership of all the denominations work together with you as partners on that issue. The Interfaith Rural Life Committee in Kansas is very new. It's only 9 months old. The next thing it will be tackling is the very serious question of what we do about this rural crisis for the future. The kinds of questions we're going to be asking is, how do you assure the future for these rural communities? What are the steps that need to be taken to be sure that Kansans will not have to go to another state to be able to support their family? What steps need to be taken to be sure that farmers, family farmers, are going to be able to stay on that land and do the one thing they love best, produce food for the rest of us to eat. We're just beginning, and we're very grateful that the Jewish community is a part of that committee with us. Serving from your ranks on that committee are not only David Goldstein, but also Rabbi Abrams from Wichita. And we're very grateful to have both of them with us. And I'm very grateful to be here with you tonight. I do a lot of speaking on this issue these days, but it is particularly gratifying when that's in an urban setting. When city folks are expressing the concern about what's happening in the rural communities and happening to our family farmers, I'm delighted to be with you tonight. Thank you.
AI is nothing but the best technology. And of course, the new director of, the administrative director of Kehilla District. Okay, who would like to begin asking questions?
It's really twofold. Do you believe that the 1986 political campaign, both at the national, the state, and the local levels, will appropriately address the farm issues? And to this end, how significant do you see that farmers such as Doug Hughes, who has got a LaRoche candidate running against him, and people like Wayne Price, who are farmers, are in fact running for Congress, and that they in fact be elected to represent rural communities?
Running against Doug Hughes, who's a Democrat candidate for Congress against Tom Coleman. You know, that's just to show you it's pretty serious business out there in the countryside. And that all of us together have better stand behind, you know, a good, solid, progressive candidate like Doug, you know, to this upcoming primary race, which is August the 5th. The way that we view the farm crisis and what is unfolding politically, it's just like when I talk about a moratorium and restructuring of debt. We've got Harriet Woods that's calling for a moratorium against farm foreclosures. We've got, and she also advocates higher prices for farmers. We've got Richard Gebhardt, who some people say may run for president, who has introduced what we call our fair credit legislation, which ties farmers repaying their loans back to the price issue. When prices go up, farmers pay more of their loan back, but it stops the process in a moratorium. So I think that politicians in 1986 are a lot more sensitized now because of our organizing ability of Danny with Prairie Fire in Iowa, which is the first primary state. And the rest of us, it shows, you know, what we've done. But we've got quite a bit more to go in order to really, you know, get justice out here. It takes us organizing our rural communities and further building our coalition.
Missouri has literally no redemption rights. The state of Missouri has literally no redemption rights once a foreclosure occurs. The person can literally be thrown out of their home in about 45 days. While the state of Kansas allows for a minimum amount of acreage, at least up to 18 months of redemption rights. Has the farmers themselves stormed Jefferson City and demand decent redemption rights in the state of Missouri? And I address that to the representative from the state of Missouri, too. I'd like to hear what Mr. Wiggins has to say about that.
Farmers in the state of Missouri, we haven't stormed asking for redemption rights. We've centered our focus on moratorium and restructuring and price. But there is a model program that Danny Levitas can talk about that was just passed in the state of Iowa that we're currently getting the legislation up to us, to the farm movement people in Missouri, so we can ask for the same thing. Would you like to talk about that?
It was possible under foreclosure, under the situation where a farmer missed their payment, for example, on their real estate loan, that within a very short period of time, they too would also suffer from foreclosure. And while we had a right of redemption, that is to say the farmer could stay out there and live on the home, and if the farmer could come up with the amount of debt that they owed, they wouldn't be put off the farm. For all functional purposes, it was impossible for that farmer to raise the money that was equal to the amount that was bid at the sheriff's sale, much less once the farmer missed the payment. And again, keep in mind, this is someone who may have paid faithfully on their mortgage for 30 years and then may miss one payment of $12,000 and then receive a notice from the lending institution 10 days later in the mail saying, pay us the $473,000 that you owe us. The legislation that we passed does a number of things. First of all, it mandates that if a farmer misses the payment, the lending institution cannot immediately call the full balance of what's owed, due, and payable. They have to give the farmer notice to cure. They have to give the farmer at least 45 days to come up with the missed payment. Now, nowadays in the countryside, trying to come up with $12,000 is about as hard as coming up with $473,000, but it does say something to address the problem that someone who's paid faithfully on their note shouldn't be put out through foreclosure so quickly. But it also does a set of other things. It mandates by law, without a meeting, a mandatory meeting for the purposes of mediation, with an impartial third party funded and trained properly by the state to help the farmer and the lender work things out. Now, if that condition deteriorates further and the actual foreclosure occurs, we have done two final things. One is to say that when they take that whole piece of property at the sheriff's sale and sell it to the highest bidder, which usually tends to be the bank who foreclosed to begin with, the farmer can go and request that a specific portion of land, usually the house and 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 acres, be set aside separately for a fair and reasonable bid, and that the farmer can then separately redeem that house and portion of acreage. And it is a lot easier to come up with the $30,000 or $40,000 for your house and building site in that 1-year time period. And then finally, we're at the Supreme Court level now in Iowa arguing some cases to say that the farmer himself or herself should have the unconditional right of first refusal to rent that farm ground if they in fact are foreclosed on. Now, all the kinks are not ironed out. Some of the lending institutions are going to challenge some portions of this law in court as unconstitutional, and it doesn't plug all the holes. A complete moratorium, as Mr. Allison suggested, is what's needed. But in the state of Missouri, let me just say it very quickly. The first farm family I ever worked with closely who suffered from foreclosure in northern Missouri, it was about 4 years ago, they opened the newspaper one day and read that their farm was going to be sold on the steps of the county courthouse, and that was entirely and completely legal, and they had no opportunity for their day in court. Foreclosure by advertisement in the state of Missouri. So you here in Missouri have some very hard work you need to be doing to address some of those equitable issues. Thank you.
Chester Kaplan.
Chapter 3 of Mein Kampf didn't attack the Jews. It attacked all lawyers and bankers. Now, surely, your friend, now at podium, will tell you that it isn't true that there aren't any lawyers helping the farmer. It isn't true that all bankers are paying off all lawyers. It isn't true that all bankers should be hanged and their banks burned down. Surely your method of solving the farm crisis is not abandon law and order. Surely you have some other method other than attacking the people you attack.
There's a lot of defensiveness in both the rural community and the community at large. I think defensiveness exemplified in your remarks that suggests when criticisms are offered, and I believe in a constructive spirit, and criticisms that are also framed with very rational law and order legislative alternatives that I just outlined. As a matter of fact, it unfortunately is the case that very, very few farmers can retain an attorney who can responsibly represent them, who they can afford to pay. And it is also true that while numerous banks and lending institutions are going broke as a result of the farm crisis, there also exists, I think, a very desperate mentality within the financial community, a desperate form of reasoning which results in the individual foreclosures on many farmers, I think, as they might justify individually to recover their losses, but when you compound foreclosure after foreclosure after foreclosure, I think the case can and should be made that something, that a legal framework must be provided for to prevent that snowball of foreclosures, which then fuels a tremendously downward spiral in land values as the result of the magnification and intensification of those problems. I can simply say I regret most deeply that you took offense at my remarks.
The issue of the care, the medical care of people on farms is also reaching a crisis of almost catastrophic proportions. One of the major things that we tend to see is that when given the choice between worsening their already desperate financial situation or getting good health care, many farmers are electing to say, well, I don't have any choice. I can't take care of my family. I can't take care of myself particularly. And when they're working 14 to 16 hours a day and they're under great stress and can't sleep, what we're having is a situation where there's much more need for health care and everyone is turning their back on them, particularly insurance companies. In this respect, by the way, people with chronic disease are also probably going to be in a similar situation, and already the resistance to pooled high-risk medical legislation is very evident in both Kansas and Missouri. What I'd really like to ask Roger is, how can we help form a coalition between our groups, people with chronic illness, like people from American Cancer Association, ADA, and others, and your group? How can we be helpful together? Because I think the farmers perhaps are being the worst hit, but there are others who are also involved. And I really think we need each other, because without each other, I don't think we can beat insurance companies and other vested interests.
We have not only the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, but there's a Farm Alliance of Rural Missouri that represents, most of the major farm groups in the state of Missouri. And there's a couple other organizations that run rural hotlines. And we do come up with things like that. Those types of problems where people don't have, like Dorothy laid out, the first thing that goes is the insurance on the family. And so maybe we can get together after this is over with and trade phone numbers and maybe set up some sort of support network and add it to the referral system that the Missouri Rural Crisis Center already offers.
No. Actually, that is some of the most common mythology out there. One of the things that we've done is we've produced a pamphlet called Who's Behind the Farm Crisis? And basically, we're fairly proud of it because it lays out the facts and figures. It shows that on the factual basis, Jews actually are a smaller percentage of the managers and owners of banks than they are in the population as a whole. And even in the New York Banking Center, which is our stronghold, we're not doing so well either there. So, we should try better. In terms of the Federal Reserve, that's another major myth, and we've countered that in this little brochure also. And the part of it actually that I'm most proud of is that we've managed to convey 5,000 years of Jewish history in 5 paragraphs to help without rabbinical supervision. brochures explaining how Jews don't run the banks in the Federal Reserve. We've distributed 15,000 of those pamphlets in the rural countryside since last November through organizations like Danny's and Rogers out to farmers. So I think that we're going ways in educating people to those very nefarious myths. Those facts at my fingertips. In terms of the Federal Reserve, there's no Jewish involvement in the operating. We were nudged out of that one. We're trying to work our way in.
Statement, if I may.
Sure.
Okay. We really, the things in human beings that they have to have, they just not help it. In different terms of different nations and different types of people, that they had suffered through not eating. If it was a Jew in Germany that did not eat today, it's maybe the farmer here in Kansas City, Missouri, in the United States. I don't remember seeing the farm of the farmers brought into television or as a program to donate or help to get money like any other type of programs to get for a certain type of disease. I don't really believe the problem cannot be solved because I am from Israel and the time is hard over there. And as it is, they had farmers, my whole family of my mother's side, they're all farmers. And they had a hard time. And they had to redo everything from nothing. But it did not happen by an individual or by pointing out that the Jew may have the bank. If he doesn't have the bank, it's because he may have not slept many years before he established to have what he had. This is a democratic country. It is a country of people that want to live in freedom. Yet it is like a cancer when it starts beginning to creep on some certain type of people, if it is black, if it is a Jew. In a time of crisis, I don't believe we can point a finger and say, this is the problem. And those are the people, either insurance people or bankers. I think it is for the idea of all people to really know that the idea of the farmer problem, you hear it more money by the communication of TV. And I think if we hear and try to say that the Jew is having the money and is one of the things, you can't do that. Because there was time that the Jew did not have anything to eat, and it is not up to us that we choose today, okay, I'm not going to eat for a month, and I will be okay. You have to have it. It's about the world us putting something together for helping each other, but really by opening also the channels of the farmer can teach a lot to the Jew. The Jew himself came from farmland, yet he was able and managed to do other things. They are simple people. And the truth of it is also farmers in Israel had a similar crisis to what's happening today over here. It is not only in America. I think it is just the idea of not having the knowledge of how to maybe operate the farm versus the second middleman to operate into the third and fourth and so on.
In a different type of moral crisis, the universities managed to start 50 years behind the times and go further backwards. And I'm wondering what resources there are there if they are part of this solution as you started out.
The report that I quoted from, the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, which laid out those figures in very clear terms, offered us a very useful tool by which we could then go to Congress and say that we had a farm policy which would cost the taxpayer of the United States almost nothing and yet provide to farmers a real increase in net farm income. Indeed, give farmers a fair return and a fair price. And so in some cases, although not too frequently, the data that emerges from many of those land-grant institutions is quite helpful. Although under other circumstances,
farmers feel real apprehensive about the Extension Department because they relied on them for advice through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and basically they did everything that the Extension Department told them to do. The smart manager was a highly leveraged manager, and now the highly leveraged manager is out. And there are some things that they're doing that are fairly constructive. There are stress seminars that that they are conducting, which is good to bring people together and talk about how to combat the stress of losing your farm. But then again, on the other hand, they say the solution to our crisis is to grow potatoes and tomatoes, and it's kind of hard to even think about doing that when the capital that it takes to buy that machinery and turn your whole operation in costs more sometimes than what your total farm bed is already. And potato growers in Maine are dumping their potatoes in the street because they don't receive enough for the potatoes to meet the cost of production. So we need them to be just a little bit more aggressive and advocate higher prices for farmers and a moratorium and restructuring of the debt and emergency funds out here so we can feed our families.
Property that is foreclosed upon, who benefits by it other than the bank? Who buys that property?
Growing acres where they have repossessed that acreage and kicked family farmers off. In many cases, those houses are vacant, the buildings fall down, the farms grow up in the weeds and the trees, or if they can get another farmer to farm it, he's going to basically rape the ground to get all the resources out of it that he possibly can. And so who ultimately pays for that, is you, the taxpayer. When a bank buys a property back on a foreclosure for $800 an acre, and the property is only worth $250 an acre, there's a lot of ground that financial institutions, not only the Farmers Home Administration, is holding right now, because farmers, first of all, don't have the money, other farmers, to make that type of expenditure to buy that property, even at a cheap price.
Gentleman, do you wish to amplify on that, or do you have another question, or? I'm sorry, Sylvia, you had a question too? No, I tell you, I said that we were going to cut it off, and we are in fact going to cut it off. Well, I'm sorry, Sylvia, really, because we do have other things to cover, and therefore we will continue with talking about the action things. Now, in the social hall, when you leave, after you write your letter, the first action thing you're going to do, after I finish telling you about all the action things to do, is that everybody's going to, at least we invite everyone, to write a letter to your member of Congress in regard to this issue. And you have this stuff before you. Harvey Kaplan, the chairperson of the JCRB, will give you instructions about that in a few moments. But before we get to that, let's do a couple other things and inform you. There will be, so you know you're going to write a letter, and those of you who like to write letters and feel that that's a significant thing to do, which we believe it is, there will be a place out there you can sign up to be on our farm letter writing committee, which is called Right for Family Farms. Okay? So that when there is legislation affecting family farmers, we will contact everybody in that list and tell them what's up. And tell them the kinds of issues that we're dealing with, and then you can be responsive for that. So that's one thing you can sign up for. There's be a table out there where you can sign up to be on the committee Right for Family Farms. Then we do a telegraph bank. Many of you are on our Israel telegraph bank. Now we're going to do a farm telegraph bank, which means that you authorize us to send a telegram in your name on farm legislation. And there's on the table a letter describing to you in great detail what that is, how much it costs, how you, if I recall, it costs about $4.65 a mailogram now. And you can choose to sign up for one or more, whatever you want. And that'll give you another opportunity, and that's real important. And it's important because sometimes we'll get a call saying that we need to have there will be a vote within the next 24 hours. And we can't go to the letter writing committee to get them to write letters because it's too late. And this way we can knock out a bunch of mailograms that you've authorized. So please do that. Please sign up for that. This will be our farm legislation. And you will be informed. In this case, it differs from our Israel telegraph bank, because in this case you'll be informed in advance as to what the specific legislation will be that we know that's coming up, so you can authorize your approval of that. With Israel, we just assume that there is total consensus. With farm legislation, there may not be, and we will give you a briefing before on the kinds of legislation that will be available. If you don't agree with it, you don't have to do it, even if you sign up for the Telegraph Bank. All right, now there's a petition campaign that is out there. There's an organization called National Save the Family Farm Coalition, made up of 26 farm organizations. And they ask for, on that petition, the kinds of stuff that Roger was talking about. Higher prices, emergency food aid, a way to restructure the debt. So those points are listed on those petitions. So go out and sign one of the petitions. Okay? Sign one of the petitions. Those of you who agree with those points. If you don't agree with those points, you know, they may not represent everybody's point of view. It's all right. There are other activities. Those of you who do, in fact, agree with those points, we have a bunch of petitions. Take them to your organizations. Women's American Art does not have to be the only organization to be totally committed to this. Everybody can be totally committed to this. And your organizations can be part of this effort to work on this problem. So please take one if you believe that your organization is the kind of organization where you can get signatures, because you see, I want to have Jewish signatures on these petitions so we can send them to the farmers, so the farm people will know that Jews are concerned, and we can send them to our legislators in Washington and in the state legislatures so that they know urban people are concerned. So it's important to sign the petitions. It's important for Jews to participate in this project. So take those petitions. Now there's also a table, you heard Roger has a table for the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. There's a table for legal aid of Western Missouri, because they're helping farmers by providing pro bono services for farmers. And they have an 800 number for a legal hotline for farmers. So go out and see that and talk to the representative from Legal Aid who's out there. And finally, before we get to your writing a letter in regard to helping farmers, there's one other thing, and those of you who have looked in front of you will see that there is an envelope there. And I will tell you, without any shame whatsoever, that envelope is for you to give money to help farmers who need assistance. And I say that to you without any shame, because people say it is difficult to raise money. They are embarrassed about raising money. I have no embarrassment whatsoever about standing in front of you raising money, because this is a just cause, and you can afford it. So give money in the envelope, but I will never ask you about it. All right, now I would like to call Harvey Kaplan, the chairperson of the JCRB, Jewish Community Relations Bureau, who is an attorney, who is a member of the executive committee of the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, vice chairperson of the NJCREC National Committee on Farm and Rural Anti-Semitism, and he's played a leading role in shaping the national Jewish policy on farm anti-Semitism and the farm crisis. He is the president of my agency. He's a good man, a warm human being, and a committed Jew. He'll tell you about how to work on this letter. And thank you all so much for coming. When you're done with the letter, then you can go have coffees and cookies, sign up for it. Oh, wait, I forgot the farm tour. You would have been real unhappy if you wouldn't have known about that. On August the 3rd, there's a table out there. On August the 3rd, we're going to do a farm tour to Chillicothe. Roger's agency is involved, he's involved. And we're going to, for $10, we'll spend about 3/4 of Sunday on August the 3rd. We're going to leave from a convenient point. We're going to have buses or they're jitneys, what are they called, Judy? Pardon? Vans. We're going to have vans to schlep you to Chillicothe. You'll see two farms and hear from the farmers who live on those farms, hear about the problems that they have, and then we're going to go to Chillicothe. We're going to participate in the vigil there. And then we're going to have dinner with farmers who live there. It's going to be a great event. You will learn a great deal, and you're all welcome to come, and you can sign up for that out there. And with that, here's Harvey Kaplan.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank each and every one of you for coming here tonight. This has been a marvelous turnout. I think you're all to be commended for coming here to educate yourselves, but more importantly, you're doing something that will affect, hopefully brightly affect the future of the Jewish community. This is something that we must take a stand on. And you will notice in your packets that you have with you a one-page sheet that says Right for Family Farms. And if you just refer to that right now, I'd like to tell you that it has the names of your senators in Missouri and in Kansas and your Congress people. And it is most important that you write to your legislators to let them know how you feel about these issues. It is amazing how many issues our legislators don't hear anything from their constituents on. Or if they do hear something, they can count the numbers of responses on the fingers of their hands. So that if you do take the time to write, you can have an influence. Now, there are some suggested points here. As David said, you may or you may not agree with all of the points. But hopefully you have become sensitized through what you have heard from our marvelous panel tonight to some of these problems. And hopefully you do agree with the majority of these points. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You can express your feelings after what you've heard here tonight. But I would like you, before you leave here tonight, to commit yourself to writing a letter. And if you will put that letter in an envelope and you will address that letter to the congressman or senator of your choice, there will be a table back in the social hall for you to leave that letter. We'll mail it for you. You don't have to do it. But I urge you to please take just a couple of minutes and write a letter and tell your congressman that you think farmers need a fair price for their products, that you think that we need programs to restructure the farm debt, that you think that we need an early release of loan funds so they can have cash for spring planting, and that you think that emergency survival assistance is a very important thing. Take the time to do that, because in doing that, you will be helping the farmers, and you will be helping to ensure the survival of the Jewish community, and you will be stemming the tide of anti-Semitism in rural America. Thank you for turning out tonight.